In 1929, Mate Brezovic and Stefan Papaivanov were executed in the Soviet Union on accusations of being spies. Brezovic had been a KPJ member since 1920, while Papaivanov had been active in left-wing circles since before the KPJ was conceived. While Brezovic was objectively a spy, as he had begun working for the Yugoslav royal dictatorship in 1929, Papaivanov's guilt is up in the air. Regardless, when the Yugoslav immigrant community was being suppressed in the 1930s, these were the two cases that were repeatedly referenced as justification for Soviet vigilance against the Yugoslavs. By the 1930s, many Yugoslavs were residing in the Soviet Union. Ivan Oshak describes 4 categories of Yugoslav immigrants at the time. The first were students who came to Russia before the October Revolution and decided to stay after the Bolsheviks came to power. The second were former Austro-Hungarian POWs who participated in the Bolshevik Revolution and stayed in the country following their victory in the war. The third were economic migrants who wanted to come and participate in the building of socialism in the USSR. The last group, the one which is of particular interest to us today, are those political immigrants, those Yugoslav Communist Party members who came to the Soviet Union for training or because they had been exiled from Yugoslavia. In the last video, for example, we mentioned Đuro Đaković and Milan Gorkić, 2 KPJ members who had been in the USSR for training. Other Yugoslavs who were residing in the Soviet Union were Kamilo Horvatin, Kosta Novakovic, and Ante Siliga, who aside from Tito is perhaps the most familiar Yugoslav communist to Western audiences. Like the others, Siliga immigrated to the USSR after he was exiled from Yugoslavia following the banning of the KPJ. He first traveled to the Soviet Union in 1926, where he became a professor at the Communist University of the National Minorities of the West, or KUNMZ. Prior to coming to the USSR, he and another Yugoslav immigrant, Vojislav Vujovic, were allowed members of the KPJ left, and in the Soviet Union, they became supporters of the left and later united oppositions. At the KUNMZ, Siliga would join a Trotskyist group, and in the late 1920s, he and other Yugoslav leftists formed the Leftist Group of 41. In 1930, this group sent an open letter to the Comintern Executive Committee in which they criticized the KPJ party leadership for their so-called rightist deviations. While Siliga and some of the other signees of the letter were open Trotskyists, not everyone in the Group of 41 identified as such. Even within the letter where they were denouncing the right, some of the other signees made sure to distance themselves from Siliga, but apparently it didn't matter because the response by the Comintern executive to this letter was to expel everyone who signed it from the school. According to Stefan Gužvica, this letter was still used as pretext to punish both leftists and rightists in the KPJ. A purge in the party would occur from 1932 to 1933. The Comintern had expected 25% of KPJ members to be expelled. The left factionalist Đuro Savić and the right factionalist Sima Marković were both victims of these expulsions, albeit for different reasons. Marković was expelled because he refused orders to leave Yugoslavia to avoid being arrested. He was not even aware that he was expelled until he did get arrested in Belgrade in 1930. Savić, on the other hand, was expelled because he was opposed to Comintern meddling in the party. When Gorkić became party leader in 1932, as we mentioned before, he took up a big tent approach. Although he did not support the left-wing viewpoint, he attempted to make common cause with his left-wing adversaries so that the party could move forward. Gorkić was quite lenient, very conciliatory, and this aspect of his personality would be what got him killed in the first place. Gorkić was a friend and ally of Bukharin, and in some ways he was similar to Bukharin in that he seemed to prefer compromise over struggle. This applied not just in relation to factions in the party, but to Gorkić's personality as a whole. He was not very hard on his subordinates, especially his close friends. He reincorporated expelled left factionists into the party, and his Popular Front strategy advocated something close to liquidationism and allowed liberals to be equal, if not dominant, partners within a coalition. His left-wing opponents increasingly viewed him as a right deviationist, and unfortunately for Gorkić, whatever his intent was for his strategy, all of his actions would cause a domino effect leading to his demise in the future. Stefan Gužvica has looked into the situation surrounding Gorkić's demise and has found that it all starts with the people who Gorkić chose to bring into his inner circle. Ivan Gržetić Fleischer, Živojen Pavlović, Rodoljub Čolaković, and his close friend Adolf Muck. Čolaković's and Pavlović's crimes were not quite severe, but would have reflected poorly on Gorkić since he was their sponsor. Čolaković was a Bosnian like Gorkić, and they had both been friends since 1919. Following the death of Drasković, Čolaković was arrested and spent 12 years in prison. When he was released, he immigrated to the USSR and enrolled at a communist school. It was in 1937 that Čolaković began to be viewed with suspicion. He had previously published a text titled ABCs of Leninism, a text which was later denounced as a Trotskyist text, and in due time he would just be straight up accused of being a Trotskyist. Gorkić's mistake with Čolaković was defending the publishing of that book. Pavlovich, who was Gorkić's personal secretary, committed an even deeper sin by actually meeting and interviewing Trotsky while he was in exile in Turkey. In 1937, he would be removed from party posts, and in 1940, he would be expelled from the party after publishing a book critical of the Great Purge through the Yugoslav state. Still, both of their transgressions weren't enough to be life-ending for Gorkić. It would be the screw-ups of Fleischer and Muck that truly got Gorkić killed. Fleischer had been a KPJ member since 1920. He rose to party leadership alongside Gorkić in 1932. As he rose in the party ranks, he was given a new job to work on the International Control Commission, and thus he dealt with expulsions in the party. Fleischer's first allegations began appearing in 1935 and 1936. He would be accused by fellow party members within Gorkić's inner circle of various misdeeds. Perović accused him of freely discussing confidential party information with non-party members. Tito said that he was an alcoholic, and Vladimir Čopić accused Fleischer of being involved in an underage relationship with a 16-year-old member of the Communist Party youth, as well as being a womanizer. According to Guzvica, while Broz and Perović had genuine issues with Fleischer's behavior, it seemed that Čopić's endgame was to attack Gorkić with Fleischer as his medium. Either way, Fleischer was receiving too many complaints, and the International Control Commission of the Comintern felt the need to step in and investigate him. Guzvica writes, Fleischer was interrogated by the ICC on March 26, 1937. He was criticized for indulging in a series of love affairs, which damaged his reputation as a party representative and of rotten liberalism. He admitted that he had an affair with a 16-year-old member of the SKOJ, meaning he had previously been outright lying to the ICC. Sexual intercourse with an underage person was considered, at the very least, to be an abuse of power. He was particularly scolded for bringing this person to study in Moscow at the International Lenin School, even though she did not fulfill the requirements for admission. Apparently, the sexual assault charges that came from Čopić were not considered, and the sources do not indicate that sexual relations with a 16-year-old were in themselves treated as sexual assault. Sexual assault accusations coming from women themselves were always taken seriously, and there is not a single case within the Comintern where the ICC did not decide in favor of the woman making the accusation. Therefore, Fleischer's suspension was a consequence of his individual failings and what was seen as a shameful failure to uphold the standards demanded by communist revolutionary struggle. Now, Fleischer never liked his job anyway, so when he was sacked, he was perfectly fine with the occasion. His transfer to Paris, where the rest of the KPJ leadership resided, was approved by the ICC and Wilhelm Pieck in May of 1937. Yet for some reason, he was still kept at his post until July 1937. Around this time, Gorkić would also be summoned to Moscow himself, and the preparations for both of their downfalls would begin. Fleischer's information and correspondences were sent to the NKVD, and from here, his story was constructed. Guzvica describes what he calls the escalation of his charges as follows. In March 1938, after almost half a year after Fleischer's execution, Damjanov discovered a document from Chernomordnik, the deputy head of the cadres department, who was also arrested and shot in the meantime. Perović had claimed in 1935 that in 1928 Fleischer had certain fluctuations and that he had sympathized with the party left, but soon sided with the anti-factionalists, remaining a dedicated supporter of the party leadership. By the summer of 1937, this was rephrased into, quote, in 1928, he openly took Trotsky's positions. He was also accused of secretly working for Mate Brezovic, who was executed in 1929 as a police provocateur, exclusively on the basis of having been a member of the same party cell. While Perović merely said that Fleischer had spoken about party affairs in Dalmatia with his landlord, the 1937 report had concluded that this landlord was a prominent fascist. The 16-year-old lover from Slovenia had become an Italian spy, and the fact that he had never been arrested in Yugoslavia a further reason for suspicion. While both Broz and Gorkić admitted Fleischer's drinking problem, Chernomordnik was now writing about Gorkić and Fleischer organizing everyday drinking parties. Finally, he was accused of wanting to escape from the country because he fears the NKVD, even though, according to his earlier letter to Gorkić, he had been granted a formal permission to leave the USSR. The other screw-up in Gorkić's camp was Adolf Muck, who was genuinely incompetent to Gorkić's detriment. As Guzvica says, he was Gorkić's greatest liability. Muck was a Montenegrin who rose to party leadership in 1934. The first area where Muck made a, quote, mistake was by openly disagreeing with the executions of those killed in the first Moscow trial in 1936. Furthermore, he wrote a statement saying that he would not self-criticize for this, quote, error of his. In any other communist party, some action might have been taken against Muck, but instead he was promoted and given an extremely important task. Muck's mission was to oversee the transport of Yugoslav volunteers to Spain. The Yugoslav government had declared neutrality in the conflict, but it was actively taking a pro-fascist stance. They banned demonstrations and any pro-Republican agitation and attempted to stem the flow of volunteers from their country over to Spain. The KPJ had secretly organized for a boat to transport hundreds of volunteers to Spain in March of 1937, but tragically, the plan was discovered and Muck would get arrested. Under police torture, Muck would reveal sensitive information about the KPJ and its Central Committee to the police. Gorkić would only dig a deeper hole for himself by calling for a campaign to be launched for the release of Muck, for he did not know about Muck's betrayal of the party. In the eyes of the Comintern, Gorkić could only be seen as either incompetent or a traitor. And to make matters worse for Gorkić, he had enemies in the KPJ who were keen on his downfall and actively participated in it. Vladimir Chopić was one of those, but someone who was an even bigger influence in Gorkić's demise was his former ally in Moscow, Kamilo Horvatin, who in 1937 began to submit negative reports on Gorkić to Wilhelm Pieck. Horvatin even went as far as to personally request to Pieck for Gorkić's removal from the post of General Secretary. One of the complaints that Horvatin levied at Gorkić was that under him, the KPJ newspapers engaged in theoretical debates with the Trotskyists rather than just straight up calling them fascists. Thus, Gorkić, he alleged, must have been secretly harboring Trotskyist sympathies. It also did not help that Gorkić's wife, Betty Glan, was arrested in June as well. Two more of his associates, Simon Milius and Gregor Vujovic, were also arrested, and Gorkić was aware of this, yet he still chose to go to Moscow anyway. Even before he showed up, it had been, quote-unquote, proven that Gorkić was collaborating with the disgraced leftist Vojislav Vujovic as well as Zinoviev and Bukharin. The cards had already been stacked against him, and Gorkić was screwed. In August, he was arrested. Then he was arrested once more on October 23rd, and then he'd be executed on November 1st. On the details surrounding his demise, Guzvica writes, "The files from Stalin's personal archive shed light on Gorkić's imagined crimes. His alleged counter-revolutionary activity began in 1923. From 1927, quote, on behalf of Bukharin, he created an anti-Soviet organization within the KIM, which he headed until 1930. After which, he was the leader of the counter-revolutionary organization within the KPJ. Furthermore, according to documents from the FSB archive, his counter-revolutionary organization within the KPJ was proven to have had ties with the anti-Comintern group of Osip Piednotsky and Wilhelm Knoren, directly connecting Gorkić to the purge of the Comintern apparatus. He was also found guilty of intentionally damaging the KPJ by filling it with Trotskyists and police provocateurs. All of this information was obtained through the confession of Fleischer, who had been arrested on the same day, and his Comintern associates Krajewski and Chernomordnik. A report to Polyachek, the NKVD officer who was investigating both Gorkić and Fleischer, alleged that the party press in Vienna, organized by Gorkić, was run by Trotskyists and Gestapo spies. Like I mentioned in the previous video, when Gorkić went to Moscow, the KPJ stopped receiving letters from the Comintern, or more specifically, they stopped receiving letters from both Milan Gorkić and Ivan Gržetić Fleischer. The next strange occurrence for the party was the sudden cessation by the Comintern of funds to the KPJ Politburo in Paris. The last time that the KPJ Politburo attempted to send a letter to Gorkić was on September 21st, 1937. And by that point, Gorkić had been gone for over a month, and no information was given to the party leadership on what to do. In Gorkić's absence, bids for power began to open up amongst the KPJ members. There were four groups, or rather, four people who were trying to present themselves as the non-factional group, and thus the proper group to take over leadership of the party. The names of these groups are not names of their own choosing, but names that have been given to them historically, either as pejoratives or based on their position. The first group, one which I mentioned in another video already, was Petko Miletic and the Wahhabists. The second group, the Parallel Center, was led by Ivo Marić and Labud Kusafats. This name, like the name Wahhabis, was a pejorative name. The name was a reference to the parallel anti-Soviet Trotskyist center of the Second Moscow Trial from January 1937. The third group was Josip Broz Tito and his comrades, who comprised the temporary leadership in Paris. The last group wasn't even a group, but just Kamilo Horvatin, who made a bid for power from the Soviet Union. Now, seeing as Tito became the future president of the Yugoslav Republic, we already know how this tale ends, that in 1940, Tito would become the party's undisputed leader. But this was not a guarantee, and it was entirely possible for Tito to have lost this struggle. But for now, let's explore the intrigues that led to Tito attaining the mantle of General Secretary of the KPJ. Let us now explore all of those who were involved in this very strange tale of communist intrigue.